Hi, Eugene Mulero with Transport Topics for a year in review video with my two buddies, Kellie Mejdrich, Appropriations and Budget Reporter at Congressional Quarterly, and Stephanie Beasley, Transportation Reporter at Bloomberg BNA. And let's get right to it. A lot happened in 2016, the elections. We got the Trump administration getting ready. But first, right before Congress went home for the holidays, they got passage of a continuing resolution. We call that in-house a CR. Kellie, you're an appropriations reporter. Set the scene, and what happened?
So right before lawmakers head home for Christmas, we have the stopgap continuing resolution. Lawmakers couldn't agree on fiscal 2017 spending, which is the regular appropriations process. So they're just kind of putting everything on autopilot, basically. There were some additional funds for certain priorities, a little more funding for overseas conflicts, some money for the water contamination problem in Flint, Michigan.
That's right.
But what made this CR battle, every year-end battle is a little bit contentious, but what made this one specifically kind of difficult for lawmakers to navigate was the fact that the CR was kind of tied to the Water Resources Development Act authorization bill, which funds some, port infrastructure projects, but also a lot of lock and dam projects across the country. Senator Barbara Boxer of California was opposed to a drought provision in that bill, so she was threatening to stall action on that bill. But there was language in that bill that made funding for the Flint water crisis in the continuing resolution contingent on passage of the Water Resources bill. All this kind of procedural stuff means that it took a lot longer than senators expected, and House members, frankly, to wrap up the year because they had to clear both of those bills. On top of that, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia created a big, public stump for coal miner pensions. And so there were this coal miner issue on the continuing resolution, the California drought on the water bill, and this Flint issue was kind of just gumming everything up, but they managed to get out
for like a day or two,
early.
It did seem the Senate was going to be stuck, and perhaps we were going to have a government shutdown because there was a December 9th deadline to get this continuing resolution out the door and to Obama's desk.
Yeah. Right, but as with many instances in the Senate, things are magically resolved in time to get everybody out of here, before the weekend and home for the holidays, and that's what happened.
In this case, 2 hours, a little less than 2 hours before government shutdown.
That's right.
Yeah, so they had to hand drive it.
Transportation groups and several Democrats on the transportation committees were critical of this funding bill that actually would expire April 28th because it maintains the 2016 authorized levels for federal transportation projects. What the several transportation groups would have wanted to see was the authorized fiscal 2017 levels. And on top of that, for the trucking industry, American Trucking Associations went around and did somewhat of a victory lap because this CR includes a provision that puts what is termed a so-called fix for the hours of service policy, Obama era, and that's something that it gives relief to truckers looking to take their weekly breaks. They no longer have to take back-to-back 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. So they can be more flexible about that.
Right, and that was interesting. As you know, last year there was a FAST Act, the Surface Transportation Law, that was passed for different surface highways, roads, transit, and part of that law was that it increased funding levels each year by a small amount, but a small amount is really ends up being a couple $2 billion in this case. So that means that those levels won't go into effect until possibly the end of April, or we don't know what they'll do when April comes. But of course that creates uncertainty for any states, cities, municipalities that were planning to maybe incorporate those funding levels in whatever projects they were going to move forward with. So now they maybe have to rethink some projects, or at least hold off on some things before, until that's resolved.
And that kind of speaks to the interplay between policy bills and spending bills, right? So these policymakers will cheer a $305 billion transportation bill, as they did last year, but then appropriators, the ones who really have it right before the president signs it. They're the ones who decide the funding levels. So in this case, we saw appropriators exert, their power over authorizers in this case.
That's right, yeah. And then what we saw at the state level in 2016, this election year, was that there was many states took it upon themselves to approve. They asked the voters, and the voters approved large funding increases for projects, transit projects, and even in my home state of New Jersey, the state legislature approved an increase of the gas tax, and that's something that voters went on in November and told state lawmakers, you got to keep that in a lockbox. All that money has to be used for transportation. So the states are really responding to what they say is a lack of support from Washington.
Yeah, right. And so, you did see a lot of ballot measures pass in different states. The Public Transit Association or Transportation Association actually called it unprecedented. There's some debate about whether or not that's true. There are lots of ballot measures usually related to transportation out there, but you did see a lot related to increasing transit funding, also increasing funding for road and highway projects. So that could be something that maybe picks up as people at the state level and the city level feel like the federal government is sort of delaying these increases or not willing to move to act in that area, and so they're taking it upon themselves to do it.
Yeah, and also in the elections, don't mean to be funny, but Donald Trump won the presidential, and he is pushing during the campaign, he was talking about a big infrastructure plan, this $1 trillion 10-year investment that would rely on tax credits to the tune of $137 billion for private investors. And to help him achieve that goal, he nominated former Labor Secretary Elaine Chao to help them, carry an infrastructure vision, which he promised during the campaign would occur during the first 100 days in office.
So this is a really interesting dynamic because Elaine Chao, as you know, is Mitch McConnell's wife, and Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader of Kentucky, is really one of the fundamental, most important leaders in Congress to construct something like a stimulus bill or something like a infrastructure bill, and he is, again, the leader that is right before legislation heads to the president. And so how that all works out is going to be really interesting. Obviously, if confirmed, right, Chao still needs to be confirmed by the Senate.
That's right.
We will have the leader of the Senate married to the Secretary of Transportation, right? And this could be a difficult dynamic for Republicans, unsure about that. That's kind of a thing to look for. Donald Trump named Republican of South Carolina, Mick Mulvaney, as his budget director, one of the founding members of the Freedom Caucus.
That's right.
He supports a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. He's supportive of eliminating the deficit. And a lot of budget experts are wondering how it's possible to pass a $1 trillion infrastructure bill without engaging in deficit spending. Some of the other plans on Trump's agenda also would require a significant amount of spending. And considering Republicans' aversion to raising taxes, it's really unclear how this is all going to add up. And so the infrastructure plan will be a very important test, I think, for the Trump administration. Yeah,
and we even got some insight from McConnell during his end-of-the-year press conference where, speaking about the Trump administration's infrastructure's ambitions, he said, he really just laid it out that it cannot look like the 2009 Obama stimulus package. It can be something that boosts the coffers and it's not revenue neutral. It has to, like you say, really pertain to conservative ideals, especially what we're seeing from the House Freedom Caucus group and other colleagues.
And it creates kind of a difficult dynamic for Republican transportation authorizers who are cheering the passage of a 5-year highway bill, saying it was a huge accomplishment. It was one of the biggest accomplishments that Leader McConnell listed in his kind of year in review that he did at the end of the year. And so to come back the next year and pass a massive transportation bill, they're going to have to do a little explaining, or maybe they won't. Maybe they'll just kind of, move ahead.
Yeah.
Right. I think it'll really revive this conversation about how do you pay for infrastructure. $1 trillion, of course, is a huge amount to put into infrastructure, and we're still waiting for the details to emerge about how this would work. President-elect Trump has talked about tax breaks for private investors in state and municipal projects. There's also been some discussion about an infrastructure bank, but it sounds like the conversation that's happening on the Hill is how do you pay for this. Kevin Brady, who's the chairman of Ways and Means, has said that he would support tax repatriation, which is like taking offshore corporate earnings and taxing that and putting them up.
Very low tax.
Right.
And critics of that call it a tax holiday.
Right, putting some of that money toward infrastructure. Some other people don't think that will work. Jim Renacci, who's also on Ways and Means, a Republican from Ohio, has talked about bringing this gas tax increase back on the table. He wants to index it to inflation. The gas tax hasn't increased since 1993. It's 18.4 cents per gallon. And you have just other people talking about vehicle miles traveled, how to tax that. So I think maybe, we might not reopen the FAST Act is what it sounds like lawmakers are thinking, but there will be more conversation about how do we pay for some of these projects, which is interesting because we did just have the FAST Act passed. So now we're going to get right back into this conversation, even though we don't really have to reauthorize surface transportation for a number of years. So yeah, it will be really interesting to see what happens if they, get any more money that they could put toward the FAST Act, or if it's just sort of like preparation for reauthorization, like far in advance, or where it goes.
But regardless of the funding, I mean, the pick of Elaine Chao is a positive development in the transportation community, right?
That's right. You have the presidents of the major groups. The road builders, Pete Ruane, said that his membership is going to be a willing partner in working with Chao and come up with some sort of a long-term infrastructure plan. The Railroads Association and the American Trucking Associations. The new president, Chris Beer of ATA, used to work with Elaine Chao at the Labor Department, so he touted that as a benefit in that the networking and the channels of communication will be open for not only the trucking industry, but the transportation industry writ large. Even the tolling group, the IBTTA, they are very optimistic that a Trump push, especially if the Trump administration goes toward privatizing infrastructure projects, that will be good for public-private partnerships, these consortiums that would charge users for riding on the roadways. But Kellie, to go back to Capitol Hill, when they come back, when Congress comes back in January and the Trump administration gets off and running, infrastructure doesn't look like it's going to be on the front of the bus. It looks like there's going to be a big traffic jam in the first 100 days.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's going to be a wild spring. It's going to be stacked with legislation. And first of all, the two budget resolution plan that the Republicans have floated as their main agenda when they get back into January is going to be a weighty undertaking. When there's the approval of a budget resolution, first of all, a lot of your readers and viewers are probably familiar with this vote-o-rama that happens,
exactly.
Where when there's passage of the budget resolution, there's an attachment of a lot of different amendments to the budget to try to speak out on certain priorities. The budget is a blueprint document. It's not signed by the president. It's basically a blueprint for spending, and it's very much kind of a partisan document. It's kind of turned into a very partisan document in certain, in recent years. And so they're going to do a budget resolution for the fiscal 16 year, which by the time we get back, is already going to be, we're going to be several months into it.
That's right.
And by the time the continuing resolution is set to expire, that'll be more than halfway into the next fiscal year. So we're going to have the fiscal 16 budget, and then what has been said about what they're going to do is after they pass the fiscal 16, which includes an Obamacare repeal potentially, they're still working it out. Then they're going to have a fiscal 17 budget resolution as well to set spending guidelines for the next fiscal year, which we're already in.
Exactly.
So there's all this stuff going on spending, and there is the risk that it could crowd out everything else. But appropriators have committed that in January when they get back, they're going to immediately start reworking, obviously, some of these appropriations bills that didn't make it to the finish line before Christmas. And then they're going to have to, work with the new administration who's preparing a new budget for an entirely new spending season. And so it's going to be really busy.
And not only that, but you got nominations. The Senate is going to be doing all the Trump cabinet picks, Secretary of State, Elaine Chao, Transportation, etc. And then we're even hearing an effort to dismantle the Dodd-Frank financial services law. So what are you hearing, Stephanie?
Yeah, I think it definitely is going to be a busy year. And, keep in mind that in addition to whatever infrastructure plan President-elect Trump puts on the table, we still have FAA reauthorization to get through.
That's right.
Of course, lawmakers sort of punted on that issue after they couldn't come to an agreement about air traffic control. In particular, Bill Schuster, who's the chairman of House Transportation Infrastructure, wanted to sort of privatize air traffic control, and it didn't really make the headway in the Senate, and it didn't make it to the House floor. So now we have to revisit that because the bill that they did pass in the summer expires at the end of September. So that's going to come up pretty soon, in addition to talking about the Trump infrastructure package, and in addition to all of these other issues. So it's going to be very, very busy.
And FAA reauthorization on top of all that at the end of September. I mean, we're going to have the end of September is when the new fiscal year is going to start.
Exactly.
And then at the end of March, we're going to have the debt ceiling issue compounding on top of the appropriations issues that were unfinished. And so it's really anyone's guess how things are going to progress next spring, but it's going to be a jam-packed schedule.
It was a exciting 2016, and already it looks like it's going to be a very exciting, jam-packed, busy 2017.
Yep.
Stephanie, Kellie, thank you for joining us, and
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
check out their reporting, follow them on Twitter, and check out ttnews.com for breaking news on freight transportation and trucking industry news. Thanks.